The probe arrived without any warning. It did not fire any weapons. It did not send any message. It simply appeared at the edge of the solar system one Tuesday morning, the way a stranger might step into a room, look around quietly, and then leave without saying a word. Earth's deep space sensors picked it up at 4:17 in the morning, and within the hour, every major government on the planet knew something was out there. By sunrise, the phones of every top military officer and scientist on Earth were ringing. Captain Leon Adler was eating a piece of toast when his phone rang. He was a calm man by nature. Not cold, not distant, just the kind of person who did not panic easily. He had served 12 years in the Earth Unified Fleet, had flown 3 long-range deep space patrols, and had once kept a damaged ship together with nothing but duct tape, a broken engine, and the kind of stubborn attitude that made his crew both love and mildly fear him. He listened to the voice on the phone for 30 seconds, set his toast down, and said, "I'll be there in 20 minutes. He was there in 15. The Earth liaison vessel EUV Resolute was already powered up and waiting at the orbital dock when Leon arrived. Standing at the bottom of the boarding ramp was Dr. Nina Castillo, a short woman with dark eyes and the particular kind of focused expression that people get when they have been thinking very hard for several hours and have not yet had coffee. She had been the one to crack the alien signal frequency 8 months ago, a discovery that had quietly changed everything and had been kept secret from the public ever since. She was holding a data pad in one hand and had 3 pens stuck behind her ear, which was her normal state. "They sent a probe," she said as Leon walked up. "I heard," he said. "What kind?" "Scanning type. It looked at us for about 2 hours. It checked our satellites, our military signals, our biological data from the atmosphere, our planet's surface temperature patterns, our ship movements." She paused. Then it left. Leon looked at her. "That's it." "That's it," she said. "It didn't stay. It just took notes." The Resolute launched within the hour, carrying Leon, Nina, a crew of 40, and a great deal of nervous energy. Admiral Pete Harmon watched the ship leave from ground control, standing with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, the way he always stood when something was happening that he could not shoot at. Harmon was a big man with grey hair and the kind of face that had seen too many difficult mornings to be surprised by one more. He did not like waiting. He did not like unknowns. But he understood that this particular unknown was not his to solve with a gun, so he stood and watched and said nothing. 3 days after the probe left, the transmission arrived. It came through on the same frequency Nina had identified 8 months ago. It was long and complex, layered with data and audio and something that was almost like light pattern code. Nina and her team worked for 18 straight hours to fully translate it. When they were done, she walked to Leon's cabin, knocked on the door, and handed him a single printed page. He read it once. Then he read it again. It was a formal communication from something called the Galactic Conclave, a federation of over 400 different species spread across a wide stretch of the galaxy. The letter was polite in the way that letters from very important people to very unimportant people are always polite. It explained that humanity had been detected, assessed, and formally reviewed. It explained that the Conclave welcomed new species in the spirit of galactic community. It explained that Earth had been assigned an official classification in the Conclave Species Registry. Humanity's classification was Class 2, Minor Threat. Leon set the paper down on his desk and looked at it for a long moment. He was quiet for long enough that Nina, who was standing in the doorway, tilted her head and said, "Are you okay?" He looked up at her. Then, slowly, a small smile crossed his face. "Did you read the full classification index?" "Yes," she said. "Class 1 is species with no spaceflight at all," he said. "Yes," she said. "And we are Class 2. One step above species that can't even leave their planet," she said. "Yes." There was a silence. Then Leon laughed. It was a short, quiet laugh, but it was genuine. Nina stared at him for a moment, and then she laughed too, and within 5 minutes the laugh had spread down the hall and into the common room where 6 crew members heard it, asked what was funny, read the paper, and started laughing as well. The classification leaked to the public within 48 hours. The governments of Earth had tried to control the flow of information, but the translation had passed through too many hands, and someone with a phone and a poor sense of timing had posted it. By the following morning it was everywhere. News channels ran it on a loop. Talk shows debated it with great energy. Social media exploded in a way that social media always explodes when something both enormous and slightly absurd happens at the same time. The reaction was not what the Galactic Conclave had likely expected. There was no widespread panic. There were no riots. There were protests in a few places, mostly people holding signs that said things like Class 2, with large question marks, and some people who were genuinely frightened, and some governments that issued stern official statements about respecting Earth's dignity. But underneath all of it, the dominant mood that ran through the population of the planet was something harder to define. It was quiet. It was dry. It was the particular feeling of a person who has just been told they're not good enough, and who has decided, very calmly, that they are going to prove every word of that wrong. Admiral Harmon noticed it. He was standing in a hallway at Fleet Command when a young officer walked past, caught his eye, and said nothing, just gave him a small nod that somehow carried a great deal of meaning. Harmon turned to his aide and said in a low voice, "They just made the oldest mistake in the book. They told us we couldn't." His aide looked at him. "What do we do?" Harmon watched the hallway for a moment. People were moving quickly and with purpose, the way they always moved when something had changed and everyone had quietly decided, at the same time, that things were going to be different now. "We get to work," he said. Back on the Resolute, Leon was reading the second half of the Conclave's transmission, the welcome packet, as Nina called it. It explained that humanity would be granted observer status in the Conclave. Not membership. Not voting rights. No access to advanced technology exchange programs. No seat at any table where decisions were made. They would be assigned a species caretaker to manage their integration, a bureaucrat from a species called the Veth, whose job was essentially to babysit minor civilizations until those civilizations either grew up enough to matter or quietly faded away. The welcome packet was 47 pages long and managed to be condescending on every single one of them. Leon read it all the way to the end. Then he closed it, looked out the viewport at the stars, and said nothing for a while. Nina was sitting across from him, already filling a notebook with observations about every species mentioned in the packet. Their biology, their politics, their histories, the small details that most people would have skimmed over without a second thought. "How long before we can reach their station?" Leon asked. "At current speed, 16 days, Nina said without looking up. Leon nodded slowly. "Good," he said. "That gives us 16 days to learn everything we possibly can." Nina turned a page and kept writing. The Conclave Central Station was the size of a small moon. That was not a comparison or an exaggeration. It was simply a fact, the way the height of a mountain is a fact. When the EUV Resolute dropped out of faster-than-light travel and the station appeared on the forward view screen, the entire bridge went quiet. Nobody said anything for almost a full minute. Even Nina, who had been writing notes the entire journey and had barely looked up for 16 days, stopped writing and stared. The station hung in the orbit of a massive orange gas giant called Velara. It was dark in places and lit in others, covered in structures that jutted out at strange angles, docking arms that stretched for kilometers, observation rings, communications arrays, and what appeared to be entire districts built on the outside of the hull-like cities on the surface of a floating world. Ships moved around it constantly, hundreds of them, of shapes and sizes that made Earth's entire fleet look like a collection of toys. Leon stood at the viewport with his hands behind his back and said nothing. He had a habit of going very still when something was important, the way some people go still when they are listening hard to a sound they almost cannot hear. 16 days of reading, Nina said quietly beside him, and I still feel like I know nothing. That's the right feeling to have, Leon said. Hold on to it. They were guided in by an automated docking signal to a section of the station called the Observer Wing. The name sounded grand. The reality was a set of narrow corridors, small rooms with low ceilings, and a waiting area with chairs that had been designed for at least 3 species that were not human. A faint smell like old paper and machine oil hung in the air. Everything was slightly too dim. It had the feeling of a place that nobody important ever visited. Curator Dren was waiting for them at the end of the docking corridor. He was Veth, a species that stood about chest height to an average human, with wide flat heads, large yellow eyes that blinked sideways, and skin the color of old moss. He wore a long formal robe covered in official insignia that he clearly felt very good about. He was holding a datapad and looking at it as Leon and Nina walked up, the way a person looks at something when they want to make clear that you are not the most interesting thing in their day. The human delegation, Dren said, not looking up. You are 7 minutes late. We apologize, Leon said pleasantly. The docking approach took longer than the automated guide estimated. Dren finally looked up. He studied Leon for a moment with those wide yellow eyes in the unsettling sideways blinking way of his species, and then made a short clicking sound that Nina had already identified from her research as the Veth equivalent of a dismissive shrug. Your observer period begins today, Dren said, speaking slowly the way people speak to someone they believe will have trouble understanding. It will last no fewer than 200 years, at which point your species will be re-evaluated. During this period, you are permitted to attend open assembly sessions as silent observers. You are not permitted to speak, vote, submit proposals, or engage in formal dialogue with member species without written approval submitted 30 days in advance. He said all of this with the tone of someone reading from a document they had read many times before to many species who had never amounted to much. Do you have questions? None, Leon said. Dren made the clicking sound again and turned to leave. Your caretaker aide will bring meals compatible with human biology. If you have medical needs, submit a form. Processing takes 40 days. He walked away without looking back. Leon and Nina stood in the dim observer wing corridor for a moment. Behind them, the rest of the small human delegation, 6 people in total, including a young military intelligence officer named Colbriggs, filed in from the docking tube and looked around at their new home with expressions that ranged from unimpressed to carefully neutral. Cole was 26 years old, thin, with very alert eyes and the habit of looking at a room the way other people read a book, systematically, left to right, top to bottom, missing nothing. He had been embedded in the delegation quietly, his actual function described on official documents as administrative support. Within 2 hours of arriving, he had already walked every corridor of the observer wing, mapped the station layout from public signage alone, and filled half a notebook with observations. That evening, he sat across from Leon in the small common room and opened his notebook on the table. I've been watching the assembly session schedules, Cole said. There's a major crisis on the floor right now. A species called the Kreth Dominion, Class 9 on the threat index, which means they're near the top, has been raiding outer trade routes. They've hit 14 conclave shipping lanes in the last 4 months. 3 colonies have gone dark. Leon looked at him. And the conclave's response. That's the thing, Cole said. They've been debating for 6 weeks. The Assembly has 42 subcommittees. Every military proposal has to pass through at least 9 of them before a vote can be called. They are completely locked up in their own process. Nina leaned forward from across the table. Have you looked at the Kreth raid patterns? Cole slid his notebook across. He had drawn the raid locations out by hand on a rough map of the region. There were lines connecting them, timing notes in the margins, and 3 locations circled in red. I've been working on it since we left Earth, he said. They're following a supply chain. They hit, they collect, they retreat through the same corridor every time. If you block these 3 points, he tapped the circled locations, their entire advanced stalls. They'd have no way to resupply their forward forces. The raids stop. Leon looked at the map for a long time without speaking. The next morning, he requested a meeting with Curator Dren and presented Cole's analysis in a clean, clear, 2-page report. He kept his voice polite and his explanation simple. He said that humanity understood it was new to the conclave, but that they had noticed something in the available data that might be useful. Dren took the report. He looked at it for approximately 4 seconds. Then he made the clicking sound, the dismissive one, and set it on his desk on top of a tall pile of other papers. Thank you, he said, in the tone of someone who does not mean it. The conclave has experienced military analysts who have been studying this matter for decades. I'm sure your observations are very. He paused just long enough to make the pause mean something, enthusiastic. I will see that it is filed. He filed it in the lowest priority archive on the station's database, a place where documents went and were never looked at again. 2 weeks later, the conclave launched its peacekeeping flotilla into Kreth territory. 40 warships, the pride of 6 member species, moving in a formation that had not changed in 80 years because it had always worked before. The Kreth were waiting for them. The battle lasted 11 hours. When it was over, 14 conclave ships had been destroyed and 9 more were badly damaged. The Kreth retreated, exactly as Cole had predicted, through the same corridor, to the same position, for the same reasons he had written in his notebook 6 weeks before. The assembly descended into chaos. Voices were raised in 17 different languages. Blame moved from committee to committee like a stone being thrown between people who did not want to hold it. In the observer wing, Leon sat with his delegation in silence and watched the news feed. Senator Diane Wolfe, Earth's political observer, a quiet, precise woman who had said very little since arriving, finally spoke. She looked at no one in particular. Her voice was calm. Write everything down, she said. Every mistake they make. Every gap. Every moment they chose process over action. She paused. All of it. Nobody argued. Cole opened a new notebook and started writing, "Nobody was watching Earth." That was the thing the Galactic Conclave never quite understood about its own classification system. When you told a species it was unimportant, you also stopped paying attention to it. You filed your reports, assigned your caretaker, and moved on to bigger concerns. The Conclave had 400 species to manage, a Kreth Dominion tearing up its outer rim, and decades of political arguments to maintain. A Class II minor threat on the far edge of charted space was not something anyone lost sleep over. Earth used every single second of that. Admiral Pete Harmon had started Project Ironclad 6 weeks after the classification was made public. It was not a loud program. There were no big announcements, no press conferences, no proud headlines about what humanity was building. It existed in a quiet corner of the Earth Unified Fleet's budget under a name that sounded boring enough that nobody asked questions about it. The people who worked on it were told to work fast, think differently, and speak to no one outside the program. The first thing Harmon did was gather the smartest engineers, scientists, and military minds Earth had and put them in a room together. He told them one thing before he left them to work. "They think we are nothing," he said. "Prove them wrong." Then he closed the door and let them get on with it. Dr. Lena Park was one of the first people in that room. She was a materials scientist from a research lab in New Mexico, small and quiet with short hair and the permanent slightly distracted look of someone whose brain was always working on 3 problems at once. She had spent the last 8 years studying metal alloys for deep space hull construction, and she had theories that the mainstream engineering community had mostly ignored because they were unconventional and because unconventional ideas made people nervous. The conclave had shared basic physics data openly in their welcome packet. Standard procedure, Nina had explained, because they assumed minor species could not do much with it. They shared it the way a professor might hand a first-year student a graduate-level textbook, assuming the student would flip through it, understand nothing useful, and put it back on the shelf. Lena read the physics data the way other people read instruction manuals, carefully, completely, and with a pen in her hand. Then she went back to her lab, combined what she found with her own existing research, and approached the problem of hull construction from a direction no conclave engineer had ever thought to try, simply because conclave engineers had been building ships the same way for 300 years and had stopped asking whether there was a better way. 6 months later, she had an alloy that outperformed the conclave's standard hull material by 34%. It was not made from any rare or exotic resource. It was made from materials Earth had in abundance, combined in a way that nobody had tried before because the method looked wrong on paper until you tested it and found out it was very right. Harmon held the test results in his hands and read them twice. Then he said, "Make more of it." While Lena was working on the hull, a man named Ray Sutton was working on the ship. Ray was a test pilot and engineer, tall, easygoing, with a particular kind of confidence that comes not from arrogance but from having done very dangerous things many times and come out the other side with a good understanding of what worked and what did not. He had been flying experimental craft for the fleet for 9 years. He had crashed 4 of them and walked away from all 4, which the fleet considered an excellent record. He was given the designs for a new class of warship that the Ironclad team had been developing and told to find everything wrong with them. He spent 3 weeks tearing the blueprints apart, arguing with the engineers, rebuilding sections on paper, arguing some more, and eventually producing a final design that was faster, tighter, and stranger looking than anything Earth had ever built. It did not look like a conclave ship. It did not look like anything in the conclave's registry at all. It looked, one engineer said, like something that had been designed by people who had never been told what a warship was supposed to look like and had simply built the most effective thing they could imagine. The first one off the line was named the EUV Iron Meridian. Ray took it out on a classified deep space trial run on a cold Thursday morning, alone except for a crew of 12, heading into a stretch of empty space far enough from Earth that no one would see the test results. He pushed the ship hard from the first hour, not carefully, not cautiously, but the way you push something when you need to know exactly where its limits are. He ran combat maneuver patterns. He tested the weapons systems. He pushed the engines past the projected maximum and held them there to see what would happen. What happened was that the ship performed better than every single number in the projection report. When he brought it back and landed it, he walked down the boarding ramp and handed Harmon a data pad with the test results on it. Harmon read the first page. Then he looked up at Ray. It held at 30% above max engine output. Harmon said, "For 40 minutes, Ray said. I stopped because I got bored, not because it showed any sign of stopping." Harmon looked back at the data pad for a long moment. Then he said, "Build 11 more." Back on the conclave station, Leon was watching things fall apart. The Kreth Dominion had grown bolder after its victory against the peacekeeping flotilla. In the 14 months since the battle, it had pushed deeper into conclave territory. 2 full member species had lost colonies, not just trade routes now, but actual settlements, actual populations, gone silent one after another. The assembly floor was loud every single day with arguments about what to do, and every argument ended the way the last one had, with no agreement and no action and another committee formed to study the matter further. Cole sat beside Leon at the observer gallery above the assembly floor and watched it all with the quiet patience of someone who had long since stopped being surprised. They have the resources, Cole said one evening. They have the ships. They have the numbers. They just can't agree on anything fast enough to use any of it. Leon nodded slowly. What would you do? Cole thought about it. Hit the supply lines I marked 18 months ago. 3 points. The whole advance collapses in 2 weeks. He paused. I've updated the analysis 4 times since then. It still says the same thing. Leon said nothing. He was watching a conclave admiral on the floor below delivering a speech about the importance of measured and unified response, a speech that had been delivered in slightly different words by 4 different admirals in the past year. Meanwhile, quietly, in a part of the station that most people never visited, a reptilian alien in a grey coat was also watching. Her name was Sura. She was Surev, a species known for their intelligence work, sharp minds, and the habit of observing things for a very long time before saying anything about what they had seen. She had been assigned to routine monitoring of the observer species on the station, a job that was considered low priority and was mostly given to junior officers. Sura was not a junior officer. She had asked for the assignment herself. She had been watching the human delegation for 11 months. She had watched Cole fill notebook after notebook. She had watched Nina read files on species that Nina had no official reason to be reading. She had watched Leon sit in the observer gallery for hours, perfectly still, watching the assembly with the focused and patient expression of someone who was not merely observing but studying. She had pulled Cole's original analysis report from the low-priority archive where Dren had buried it. She had read it in full. Then she had compared it to what actually happened in the battle. She sat alone in her small office for a long time after that, thinking. Then she opened a new file on her terminal and began writing a report of her own. Not about the Kreth. Not about the failing peacekeeping strategy. About the humans. About the quiet, careful, relentless way they worked in the background of a galaxy that had decided they were not worth watching. She wrote for 3 hours without stopping. She titled the report, "We have made an error." Nobody asked for permission. That was the part that made the conclave's political flaw erupt the way it did. Not the outcome. Not even the fact that it happened. It was the simple, clean, almost casual reality that Earth had looked at the situation, made a decision, and acted, without filing a request, without submitting a proposal to a subcommittee, without waiting 30 days for written approval, without asking anyone at all. Captain Ray Sutton took the EUV Iron Meridian and 11 other ships out of Earth's lunar dock on a grey morning in early spring. No ceremony, no speeches. The fleet moved in a clean formation, accelerated to faster-than-light speed at the edge of the solar system, and was gone before most people on Earth even knew it had left. Their destination was the Valdris Corridor. The Valdris Corridor was a stretch of space on the conclave's outer rim, a long, narrow region between 2 dense asteroid fields that had become the main road the Kreth Dominion used to push its advance forces deeper into conclave territory. The conclave had been arguing for 7 months about whether to fortify it, block it, or negotiate around it. While they argued, the Kreth used it freely. Ray stood on the bridge of the Iron Meridian as it came out of faster-than-light travel and the corridor appeared on the view screen. It was dark and wide, scattered with distant rocks and the faint light of a far-off star. It looked like nothing. It looked like empty space. But Cole's analysis, updated now for the 4th time, sharper and more precise than ever, said that the Kreth Advance Force used this exact stretch every 4 to 6 days. They had arrived on day 4. Ray checked his instruments, checked his crew, and said very little. He spread the 12 ships across the corridor in the formation that the Iron Meridian's tactical system had spent 3 months designing. Not a standard conclave formation, not anything the Kreth had ever seen before. It looked loose and uneven from the outside, like ships parked without much thought. It was not. Every ship was exactly where it needed to be for what was going to happen next. They waited for 6 hours. Then the Kreth came. 40 warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the far end of the corridor, moving in the tight, aggressive formation that the Kreth always used, a thick front line designed to hit hard and fast, pushing straight through anything in its path. It had worked against the conclave peacekeeping flotilla. It had worked against every force the Kreth had faced in the last 3 years. It was a good formation for fighting enemies who responded in predictable ways. Ray watched them come and said nothing for a moment. Then he opened the shipwide channel. "Standard plan," he said. "Everyone knows what to do." What followed was not the kind of battle that looked impressive from the outside. There were no great dramatic charges, no single heroic moment. What there was instead was something that the Kreth had no name for and no defense against. 12 human ships that refused to behave the way ships were supposed to behave in a fight. They broke apart the moment the Kreth engaged, scattering in directions that made no immediate sense, pulling individual Kreth ships out of formation as they chased. 2 human ships drew a group of 8 Kreth vessels into a dense part of the asteroid field and then simply stopped, letting the Kreth come in fast and tight into a space too narrow for their formation to function, then hitting them from 3 sides at once. 3 other human ships took heavy fire deliberately, absorbing damage that would have crippled a conclave vessel but that Lena's hull alloy handled well enough to keep them fighting, drawing the Kreth's largest warships into a head-on exchange while the remaining human fleet looped around and hit the Kreth from behind. It was messy and loud, and at one point 2 human ships came within 400 meters of each other moving in opposite directions, which made both crews stop breathing for about 3 seconds. But it worked. Every part of it worked. The battle lasted 8 hours and 50 minutes. At the end of it, the Kreth advance force had been broken. Not destroyed. Ray had been specific about that in the mission brief. Disabled. Engines cut. Weapons offline. Hulls intact. 40 ships sitting still and quiet in the middle of the corridor like stones in a stream. Unable to move. Unable to fight, but alive. Ray opened a broadcast channel on every frequency the Kreth and the Conclave both monitored. He kept his voice flat and even, the way you speak when you want every word to land without decoration. The Valdris corridor is closed, he said. Any attempt to move through it will be met with a response less restrained than this one. Then he closed the channel, leaned back in his seat, and asked his crew if anyone had coffee. On the Conclave station, the news arrived like a stone thrown through a window. The assembly floor went from loud to very loud in approximately 4 minutes. Curator Dren appeared in the observer wing at a near run, which was a strange sight because the Veth were not built for speed and it showed. He was holding his datapad in both hands, and his wide yellow eyes were cycling through expressions too fast to read. Your fleet, he said to Leon, breathing hard, has engaged in unauthorized military action in Conclave-adjacent space. This is a direct violation of observer status terms. This is an extraordinary breach of. 17 Conclave ships were lost in the Valdris region last month, Leon said. His voice was calm. He was sitting in a chair with one leg crossed over the other and a cup of water on the table beside him, as relaxed as a man reading a newspaper. 3 colonies have gone dark. The Assembly has been debating action for 7 months. We took action. You are a Class 2 species, Dren said, loudly. You are not authorized. The corridor is closed, Leon said simply. No more Conclave ships will be lost there this month. Dren filed 17 procedural complaints before noon. Each one was lengthy and formal and written in the very precise bureaucratic language that the Veth were famous for. He submitted them to every relevant committee, every oversight board, and directly to the office of the Conclave Grand Arbiter. He expected them to bury the humans in process. What he had not anticipated was Sura. She appeared at the assembly floor the morning after the battle, not in the observer gallery but on the main floor itself, standing in the speaking position reserved for senior intelligence officers. She was calm and straight and carried her report under one arm. When the floor recognized her, she did not give a long speech. She said 5 sentences. She said that she had been monitoring the human delegation for over a year. She said that 11 months ago, a human officer had submitted a strategic analysis of the Kreth Dominion supply lines that, if acted upon, would have ended the raids before the peacekeeping flotilla was ever deployed. She said that the analysis had been filed in the lowest priority archive by a caretaker officer and never reviewed. She said that the battle in the Valdris corridor had ended in under 9 hours with 0 casualties on the human side against a force more than 3 times their size. She said that she believed the assembly needed to hear from the human delegation directly. Then she sat down. The chamber was very quiet. Leon had been watching from the observer gallery. Beside him, Cole was already writing. Nina had stopped taking notes entirely and was just watching, which was unusual for her. That's our opening, Leon said quietly. He had already prepared the request, the observer speech clause, buried in the original Conclave Charter, that technically allowed any registered species to address the Assembly in the event of a matter directly concerning their status. Nobody had used it in over 300 years because nobody in the observer wing had ever had anything worth saying that the Assembly wanted to hear. Leon had something worth saying. He stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the floor. The assembly floor of the Galactic Conclave was not a place built for silence. It was enormous, a wide, circular chamber with tiered seating that rose in rings from the central speaking floor, filled with representatives of over 400 species, each section buzzing with its own sounds, its own smells, its own restless movement. On a normal day, the noise was constant, a deep living hum of voices and translation systems and the shuffling of bodies that came in every shape the galaxy had produced. It had been that way for centuries. When Leon Adler walked onto the central floor, the chamber went quiet. Not all at once. It started at the edges and moved inward, the way a wave moves, one section going still and then the next and then the next, until the only sound left was the soft hum of the translation system waiting to carry his words to 400 species at the same time. He was a single human in a plain dark uniform standing in a room designed to make individuals feel small. He did not look small. He stood straight, put his hands at his sides, and looked out at the chamber the way a person looks at something they have been waiting a long time to address. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform. He simply spoke. He started with the probe. He described the day it arrived, the 2 hours it spent scanning Earth, and the 6 minutes the conclave had taken to issue humanity's classification. He did not say this with anger. He said it the way you state a fact, plainly, clearly, without decoration. He moved on to the welcome packet. The 200-year observer period. The cramped wing. The caretaker who spoke to them like children. Then he talked about Cole's report. He described every detail, the raid pattern analysis, the 3 supply line points, the projected outcome if action had been taken. He described how it had been submitted to Curator Dren in a clean, 2-page document and had been placed in a low-priority archive without being read. He described what happened 2 weeks later when the peacekeeping flotilla went in without that information. 14 ships destroyed, 9 crippled, hundreds of crew members dead from a battle that did not have to happen the way it happened. He let that sit for a moment. Then he talked about the Valdris corridor. He described 12 ships against 40. He described the outcome in plane numbers. 0 losses on the human side, the Kreth advance force disabled and stopped, the corridor closed in under 9 hours. He did not say it to boast. He said it as a data point, the same way Cole would have written it in a notebook. Here is what happened. Here is what it means. He finished by placing a single printed document on the speaker's table. It was Nina's full strategic report, 400 pages covering every species in the conclave, their military doctrines, their political structures, their histories. 3 years of careful work by a woman who had used her time in the Observer wing the way a student uses a library. He told the chamber what it contained and said that it was available to any member species that wished to read it. Then he stepped back and waited. The silence lasted longer this time. It was Sura who spoke first. She rose from her seat in the intelligence section and addressed the Grand Arbiter directly. The Grand Arbiter was ancient, an insectoid species called the Velhari, who lived for centuries and who had not personally been surprised by anything in a very long time. He was tall and still, with long folded limbs and eyes that caught light in a way that made it impossible to tell exactly where he was looking. He had been sitting in his elevated chair at the head of the chamber since before the session began, watching everything and saying nothing. Sura did not give a long speech. She never did. She said that the Assembly had spent 3 years watching the Kreth Dominion grow stronger while its own response grew slower, and that in that same period a species it had classified as barely worth noticing had quietly studied everything, built something extraordinary, and solved the problem in a single engagement. She said that the classification system existed to measure threat and capability. She said that if the system had produced a result this far from reality, the system needed to look at itself. She said the line that would later be repeated for a very long time in many places: you measured them by what they had built. You should have measured them by what they were capable of deciding to build. Then she sat down. Dren tried to speak. He rose from his seat in the caretaker section with his data pad in his hands, already pulling up his procedural complaints. The Grand Arbiter looked at him. Just looked at him. No words, no gesture. Dren sat back down very slowly and did not try again. The formal reclassification hearing was called 3 days later. It was the first time in over 800 years that a species had triggered one. The Conclave's legal archive had to be searched to find the correct process because nobody currently working in the building had ever run one before. Nina helped them find it, which the archive clerk noted was both helpful and slightly embarrassing. The hearing lasted 2 days. Nina presented the full case, not just the military record but the human story. She talked about adaptability, about the particular human habit of treating a problem as a personal challenge, about the way humans performed better when circumstances were hard rather than worse, about the long history of a species that had spent its entire existence solving things that had seemed impossible until they were not. She was not loud or dramatic. She laid the facts down one by one like stones building a path, and she let the path lead where it led. On the second day, the Conclave's classification algorithm was given the full data set, the Iron Meridian's performance numbers, Lena's hull specifications, Cole's strategic analyses, the Valdris battle record, Nina's complete report. It was the most thorough input the system had ever been given for a single species assessment. The algorithm ran for 40 minutes. When it returned its result, the terminal operator read it once, frowned, and ran it again to make sure. The result was the same both times. Class 8. Significant threat. Candidate for full membership. 3 council members stood up from their seats without meaning to. Someone in the back of the chamber made a sound that the translation system rendered, after a moment of apparent confusion, as something between a gasp and a laugh. The Grand Arbiter looked at the result for a long time without moving. Then he called for the vote. It was not unanimous. There were species who voted against it, some out of fear, some out of pride, some out of the deep institutional resistance that very old organizations always have to admitting they were wrong. But the majority held, and it held clearly, and when the final count was read aloud, the chamber accepted it with the particular heavy quiet of a large group of people absorbing something they had not expected to feel.
6 tiers.
No species had ever been reclassified by 6 tiers in a single hearing. Not once in the 800-year history of the conclave. Curator Dren was quietly reassigned to a monitoring post in an outer sector the following week. Nobody held a farewell event. Nobody really mentioned him much after that. The Kreth Dominion sent a transmission to Earth 4 days after the hearing closed. It did not go to the conclave. It went directly to Earth, addressed to the commander of the force that had stopped them in the Valdris corridor. It was short. It said that the Kreth Dominion had fought many enemies across many years and had developed a clear understanding of what different kinds of enemies were. It said that it wished to understand what kind of enemy humanity was before any further engagement took place. It said, in the blunt and direct way the Kreth communicated, that it was asking for a conversation. Admiral Harmon read the message at his desk on a quiet afternoon and allowed himself a long, slow smile. He read it twice just to enjoy it a second time. Then he forwarded it to Leon with a single line attached. Looks like they want to talk to us instead. Leon was standing at a viewport on the conclave station when the message came through. Outside the viewport, the station's main dock was visible, a wide, lit expanse where dozens of conclave ships moved in slow, steady patterns. One of them was the Iron Meridian, sitting in a berth near the center of the dock. The ships around it were giving it a wide and careful berth, not because they had been instructed to, but because the people aboard them had read the Valdris report and had made their own quiet judgments about the wisdom of getting too close. His communicator chimed. It was Harmon. Did we get it? Harmon asked. Leon watched a conclave patrol ship drift slowly past the Iron Meridian, keeping its distance without making it obvious that it was keeping its distance. He watched the station lights reflect off Lena's hull alloy in a way that made the ship look like it was glowing faintly from inside. Yeah, Leon said. We got it. Good, Harmon said. There was a short pause, and when he spoke again his voice had the tone of a man who had finished one hard thing and was already thinking about the next. Now the hard part starts. Leon stood at the viewport for a long time after the call ended, looking out at the ships and the stars and the vast, complicated galaxy that had looked at humanity 8 years ago and decided it already knew what it was dealing with. It had been wrong about that. Leon thought about Nina still writing in her notebooks, Cole still filling pages with observations, Ray somewhere in deep space putting the Iron Meridian through tests that would feed the next generation of designs, Lena back in her lab already working on something better than what she had already built. He thought about all the quiet, patient, relentless work that had happened in the years when nobody was watching, in the dim corridors of the observer wing and the classified hangars of Earth's lunar dock and the small offices where people had sat alone and decided that being underestimated was not a problem, it was an advantage. He thought about the classification. Class 2. Minor threat. He almost smiled. The hard part, he decided, was going to be very interesting.